A monster episode this week, one that I know so many people will be listening to. We try and answer the big question: is the 18-year property cycle broken? The market's been all over the place for the last 6 months, so this is an episode we had to record.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where we take time out from advising a multi-million pound property fund, which you can learn about at portfolio.co.uk, and putting together hundreds of transactions every year for our clients and bring you some of the knowledge that we've gained along the way for free. This week's episode is such an important one, but there's important stuff happening every week in the world of property that you need to know about. And the easiest way to keep up with all property news in less than 5 minutes a week is to sign up for our free newsletter, Property Pulse. So make sure you're subscribed to that one at propertyhub.net/pulse.
So let's kick off with our news story of the week. And it is good news. I love it when it's good news. Mortgages are getting cheaper. Yes, Rob, there is good news around mortgages, and we wanted to share it.
Yep, mortgage rates still coming down across every duration of fix. So whether you want 2, 3, 5 or 10, all of those products are getting cheaper week on week at the moment. But are they going to be getting cheaper still? Or is the next move up in interest rates by the Bank of England, which seems pretty likely, going to send mortgage rates rising again? Should you be fixing now? What should you be doing? Well, the news story we have this week doesn't get into all that, but luckily we have a video on our YouTube channel that does. That's just been uploaded in the last couple of days. So head over to our YouTube channel, just go to YouTube and search for Property Hub UK and find that video because, of course, as a property investor, there's not many things more important than mortgages and you need to know what's going on. So well worth going and giving that one a watch and a subscribe while you're there.
Now, in possibly even bigger news, Rob and I have both made our first property investments of the year. Yes, both of us. We've both taken action. You know, we didn't take long. It's only February when this is going out. And actually, we committed to this deal in January. So we are starting the year really strong. And it's not just us who benefit. You will benefit as well, because we're going to be bringing all the lessons of that purchase to a podcast in the near future. Because why now is really important, but where we've invested and what's got us so excited that we've both invested is really interesting too. So all the details coming up on a future podcast. But bonus, if you're a Property Hub Invest client, well then you are super lucky, because that's where we got this deal from and you're going to be hearing about it very soon. So keep an eye on your inbox. And if you're thinking, hey, I'm not a Property Hub Invest client, but I've got a bit of FOMO here, well, you can maybe, if you're very quick, go to Property Hub Invest, sign up, speak to a portfolio manager, have a bit of a strategy meeting, which is completely free. And if we feel it's a good fit for you and vice versa, then we can maybe show you the details in time. Maybe a bit of a rush, but if you're keen and you've got extreme FOMO right now, go along to Property Hub Invest. You can find that at propertyhub.net/invest. Sign up there. But to Property Hub Invest clients, we'll give you more info soon. And podcast listeners, as I've said, a pod will be on its way with all the juicy details.
I thought we'd recorded our last episode on the 18-year property cycle. We've talked about the cycle so much over the years. We've described what it is and how you can make use of it. We've talked about where we are as we move through the cycle. We've even laid out year by year what we believe will happen in the future based on the property cycle. And we'll link to all those episodes in the show notes to get you caught up if you need to. But Rob, I think we have to talk about it again, because right now, according to the property cycle, we should be going into at least 3 years of a pretty major property price boom. Doesn't feel like that though, does it?
No, far from it. So a year ago, last spring, we were starting to get into a boom. And all the signs were there that the 18-year property cycle, while a little slow, was on track. The boom had started. It was very predictable. We were making investment decisions based on it. And then, pow, the world changed. Yes, we had the Ukraine war, and we still have it, unfortunately. And we had Liz Truss, don't have her. But we had a lot of turmoil, both nationally and internationally, that meant that our economy just stalled, flattened, and actually fell. And property prices also suffered. The boom quickly came to a halt. Property prices softened. In some areas, they even fell. And the year ended up on a positive last year in terms of growth for most areas, but just a small positive. It was far from a boom. It was certainly a year of two halves. That is not what should be happening right now. So, Rob, the question is the 18-year property cycle broken?
Well, to prepare for this conversation, I went and graphed out the previous full cycle, the last cycle that played out in full, which is 1990 to 2008. So according to the cycle, roughly speaking, you should have a bust. It should take 4 years for prices to bottom out and flatline a bit, and then 14 years up. And when you look at that cycle, it's pretty spot on. So prices should have started climbing in 1994, took a little bit longer by maybe a year or so. And then, of course, we all know about the 14 years up. There's also a little dip in the middle of those up years, but in around about 2004, 2005, which is what the cycle calls the mid-cycle dip. So that was pretty much on track as well. So the previous cycle, pretty great example. But what about this cycle? Well, you count forward from 2008, so you should have seen prices bottom out in 2012, then they should be having 14 years up to 2026. And for the first part of the cycle, that is exactly what happened. So prices did just kind of bump along until around about 2012. They then grew steadily till about 2017. But that's when things started getting a bit stretched. So then had prices going pretty much sideways for about 3 years. Then from 2020, you had the start of some really strong growth. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen for the rest of this year, but it seems like that growth is over.
Now, one of the other big questions to ask beyond is the 18-year property cycle broken is the question, what may have caused it to be broken? It's been a pretty consistent way of predicting property prices roughly for a long time now. But there have been periods in the past where the 18-year property has been broken before. And Rob, when we were talking off air a few weeks back, you reminded me of this, and I think it's a great point, which was the last time the 18-year property cycle was broken was around the Second World War. And Fred Harrison has said himself that wars, major wars, can break the 18-year property cycle. Now, Ukraine is a major war, but that is not the war we're talking about, because we've had lots of wars over the last century, and none of them have broken the 18-year property cycle. But there was a different type of war that the whole world had to fight, and that was COVID. And Rob, I think it's a way to understand why it may be potentially broken, because COVID completely shut down the world. It changed everything overnight. And economically, lots of countries are still in recovery mode from COVID. And that could be the reason why the 18-year property cycle is broken.
It could be, because like a war, it resulted in lots of extra money being created, about 450 billion of it in the UK. That's the kind of thing that you see at wartime. Also, major changes in the economy. Changes in patterns of supply and demand of products and changes in patterns of land use. I still don't think we've quite figured out what all the effects of COVID were, and the ripples from it are very much still happening today. So I'd struggle to say, oh yeah, well, because of that, property prices should have done this. It's really hard to point to a specific change that you would expect to see, but I think it is completely fair to expect that it could be knocked off track. How do we know if this is still a model that we should have faith in or not? All right, so I think we've got three possibilities here. So one is that we've had the property cycle. It's ended. So the boom clearly is over, and that was it. The growth that we had between 2020 and the end of last year brought the cycle to an end, and now we go into the fall, the stagnation, and then the next boom. That's option one. Option two is that it's not over. It's actually taking longer to get going than it normally does. So we've got an extended cycle. So we've already said we had this extended pause in the mid-cycle where nothing happened for about 3 years. And then the next growth phase has been interrupted as well. Because of everything that's happened at the moment, including mortgage rates and everything else, it takes a pause and then it kicks on for the final phase. So you end up with a cycle that does play out, but over an extended period of time. And option three is there is no cycle. It's all nonsense. Depending on your view, you could say either it's been disrupted this time by different events, or it never has existed in the first place. We've all just been trying to see patterns in charts that were never there anyway, and we need to forget about the idea of a cycle altogether. So, Rob, I suppose a two-part question is, firstly, which of those scenarios do you think is most likely? But secondly, given that any of them is possible, what should people do knowing that any of those options could yet play out?
Put me on the spot, Rob. Which one do I think is playing out? Well, I think the extended version. But I don't mind if I'm wrong. In fact, I don't care if I'm wrong, because I can work with all three scenarios. All of them work for me as an investor. Because if I take the first one, the 18-year cycle's done. Well, okay, we didn't have a big boom, but we're not going to have a big crash either. It would be a 18-year property cycle light. It's not been that intense. But you know what? If that was it, and we've had the boom and we're pretty much done with the crash, and it all felt a bit, that wasn't so bad after all, then I could live with that. It means that there are buying opportunities and you could take advantage of them, and the 18-year property cycle kickstarts again. Maybe that is what's played out. The option that I think is playing out, as I've already said, is that it's extended, which means that the boom will kick on again. I believe the second half of the year will dictate whether that's the case or not, and we'll start to see property growth, the first signs that it's kicking on again during the second half of this year, which creates opportunity now. So I'm fine with that as well. And you know what? If it is all broken and it was all nonsense, then besides looking a bit silly, talking about it so much over the last few years, I can, as an investor, live with that as well. Because while we talk about boom and busts, and that all can sound exciting and it can create opportunity, I've said this before multiple times on the podcast. I don't like it. I just prefer steady growth over the long term. And property does give you that. And that's really important, and we'll come back to it. But for me, if you could say, well, you know what, you're not going to get a boom phase, but you're not going to get a bust phase, I'd much rather take that. Or if option one was we had a very minor boom and a very minor bust, then I'd take that as well. But I actually think it's option two, where we are going to get the boom and then we will get that bust. We will see, and time will tell. But Rob, we've not talked about this before we went on air. I'm keen to hear which option you think it is and what you think of all these scenarios from an investment point of view.
It's tricky. You could make a good case for any of them. You could put up a pretty good argument to say that the cycle has ended. That was it. There's plenty you could use to support that view. But I also think it's much too early to write the cycle off. As we said earlier, the early part of the cycle played out exactly as you'd expect. And then, yes, the sort of the steady growth turned into more of a flattening of growth for a few years, which is longer than you'd expect. But the cycle wasn't derailed by Brexit and all the other events that were happening around that time that everyone was very scared about. And your belief in the cycle would have caused you to keep on investing through that period rather than being scared, which it turns out in hindsight was exactly the right thing to do. And then the boom got underway. Not for the reason we thought it would, but it did. So I think a core problem with anything to do with cycles is that you have to wait till the end to go, oh yeah, that's what happened. So it's impossible for us to say right now. But if pushed, I'd go for option two. The cycle remains on track. It's just extended a little bit. And there are three reasons why I say that. The first is that property prices specifically, so compared to all prices, haven't increased by that much over the last few years. So over the last 3 years or so, property prices have gone up by about 26%. Which is loads, that is a lot, but that's only a couple of percent higher than general inflation. So the price of everything has gone up by that much over the last few years. So you look at house prices and they've gone up by a lot, so you talk about a house price boom, but you could easily look at the price of bread and talk about a bread boom, because that's gone up a lot. It's happened to everything, and that's completely different from the run into the end of the last cycle in 2008, where house prices ran way ahead of everything else. That brings me on to the second reason. The reason that house prices run way ahead of everything else in the final years of a boom is because of a kind of a speculative mania. Everyone suddenly wants to buy property, and they want to buy it purely because it's going up. And that is the definition of a bubble. People are buying based on nothing to do with the fundamentals of an asset, just because they think it's going to go up more and they'll be able to make money from that. I haven't seen any of that this time around. I know people who ended up getting into bidding wars for their own homes because they wanted to move out to the country at the same time everyone else did. And it's that part of the market that'll probably fall back down a bit now because that driver has gone away. But that's not the same thing as a speculative boom. So that just hasn't happened. And the third reason is that we haven't seen the loosening in lending standards that you normally see in the boom years. And that's what enables the speculative frenzy. Banks just want to shovel money out of the door. It's very profitable for them to lend against property. They want to do as much of it as they can. That hasn't happened either. Banks have been happy to lend, but lending has not been reckless. None of the measures that were brought in after the last boom have gone away again. So people are buying after taking into account rental stress tests, portfolio landlord checks, all this kind of thing. They're not just being given 100% of the value of the property after a surveyor's driven past briefly, which is what happened last time. So like I said, there's no way of knowing for sure, but that's why I think that it's most likely that the cycle does stay on track. It just has a bit of a wiggle up and a wiggle down as a result of the COVID weirdness, but then it does ultimately play out.
You know what? I love that we've created an app to help you invest in property. And that app is called Portfolio, where you can experience the benefits of property investment through your phone. To find out more, head over to portfolio.co.uk or search for Portfolio on your app store.
However, this is all just speculation, of course. And the fact that we and everyone else ends up speculating about the property cycle and what it's going to do so much brings me to a point that I made on a YouTube video a while back, which is I think the property cycle is really interesting, but how useful is it? The whole point of it is it's meant to give you confidence in what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future so you can plan your moves accordingly. But I think in reality, I probably know like 2 or 3 people who are actually planning to do anything with this information, as in actually sell off their portfolio when they believe they're coming into a boom and then plan to buy it all back again a few years later. The vast majority of people who I come into contact with are not going to do that and find the cycle interesting, but ultimately don't have enough confidence in it to use it to fully drive their decisions in that way. If you think about all the questions we have in to ask Rob and Rob, all the conversations that we have about, is the cycle doing this, is it doing that? Does this mean that will happen? Does that mean that this won't happen? The discussion is all about, is the cycle going to work? And if everything that happens makes you wonder if the cycle is going to work, then clearly you're not going to be able to use it to base your decisions on. And maybe that's okay. I think one thing you can say about the cycle is it's really obvious when there are really, really particularly good times to buy, but that only happens about once every 18 years, if you believe this, and you're not going to necessarily sit around waiting for it. So maybe, unless you do have complete conviction, which very few people do, it's not something you should really be worrying about that much.
I think you make a brilliant point, Rob. Most people use the 18-year property cycle as a reason not to invest. And for me, that's why I've kind of fallen a little bit out of love with it. Because we talked about the 18-year property cycle when we first discovered it because it was fascinating and we felt it was a tool we could use. But you know what we've done consistently throughout the cycle is make investments. And whether the 18-year cycle is done and finished, extended, or doesn't exist, I'll keep making investments when I see good deals. The 18-year property cycle is useful. The 18-year property cycle is entertaining. The 18-year property cycle has probably given us more talking points over the podcast over the last 10 years than any other subject. But if it's stopping you investing, you should just stop looking at it because you're costing yourself money. Whatever time you buy during the cycle, over the long term, you'll make money. And property investment should be long term. That's the whole point. Now, are there optimal times to buy? Almost certainly. Will you know exactly when they are? Almost certainly not. So don't get yourself wrapped up in the 18-year property cycle. So Rob, we've spent this whole episode talking about it, but we've also spent previous episodes talking about, well, you know what? Even if you invest at the worst time during the cycle, you'll still be fine over the long term, even the medium term. What I've not seen in this cycle, if it even exists, is the mania that we had in 2005, 6, 7, and 8. That's just not in play. And it hasn't been in play at any point. Yes, we've had some growth, but even our biggest year in this cycle was still less than 10% growth. Whereas in the last cycle, there were multiple years of double-digit growth. So for me, am I worried? No, because this is the end of this cycle. Well, it's not going to be much of a downturn, and there's great deals to be had right now because people are nervous. And we've made some. We talked about that at the start of the show. And if there's a boom to come, then great. I'll get some more upside on the investment I've just made. But you know what? If the 18-year property cycle and none of this makes sense, well, I still know over the long term, those investments we've just made in the last month and all the investments we've made over the last however many years, over the long term, will do well. And that's what you should take away from this podcast, is do the basics. Buy well. Just get the best deal you can. The numbers will tell you that. The fundamentals will tell you that. And then see it for the long term. And if you get good deals, doesn't have to be the world's greatest, just good deals over and over again, and stick in it for the long term, well, your life will be changed financially, whether there's an 18-year property cycle or not. And for me, that's more than good enough.
Okay, time now for Hub Extra, that part of the show where we try and give you that little bit more. And in the case of what we're talking about today, something completely different. This has nothing to do with property, but today's episode nearly didn't get recorded because we were having such a long and fascinating conversation before we started about artificial intelligence. It's something that I've dabbled with a little bit over the last couple of months, but our producer Dan has been going deep down a rabbit hole and was sharing some pretty incredible stuff with us about what he's found and what he believes this could do in the future. So if you don't know anything about the advances in AI that have taken place over literally the last year, and there have been some really big ones, then a good place to learn about that is YouTube. There are loads of videos that will give you an overview, and it's one of those things that it's well worth having a high-level understanding of because it is something that's going to become increasingly important in years to come. So Dan's recommended a particular video called 9 New AI Tools That Will Blow Your Mind. So we'll link to that one in the show notes. Go check it out and either get excited or get a little bit scared. I'm still not sure how I feel about this yet, but you can make your own mind up.
Oh, and by the way, The title of this episode that you've just listened to, yep, we used AI to come up with it. First time ever, might not do it again. It's incredible what's happening, and just awareness around it at the very least, whether you use it or not, I feel is important for every human, never mind property investment. So do check out that video. And make sure you check us out on Tuesday when we'll be back with Ask Rob and Rob. And of course, there's plenty of YouTube content going out all the time at the moment over at Property Hub UK on YouTube. Get over there. So that's us done for another week. Plenty to keep you busy with until we're back with the pod next Thursday. So until then, take care, have fun, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.